Hello and welcome back to this segment of Arts Talk with Virginia Scharff, the author of The Women Jefferson Loved. And I'm joined by my co-host, Jesse Gallegos, who's a law student. We are now going to take questions from the audience with Professor Scharff. So, Monique?
Hi. My question for you is, in doing your research, did you come upon any secrets or hidden information that maybe other people wouldn't have known about or talked about?
That's a fantastic question because, of course, this is one of the most studied figures in American history. His papers have been, or what's left of his papers, because they were very, very carefully, shall we say, edited. Expurgated would be another way of putting it. But so what I knew it was going to be hard to come up with something nobody had figured out, right? Or that nobody had written about. And I would have to say the thing that I found that I found most startling was the fact that when his daughter, Martha Jr., Patsy Jefferson, married her distant cousin, Tom Randolph, and they got a piece of property that was willed to them by Randolph's father that was very close to Jefferson, and they said, well, we don't want to live there. And Jefferson said, well, why not? You're going to be close to me. I want to keep my family close. And they said, well, because the stipulation from the father-in-law was that they take this land with slaves. And at that time, they said they did not want to farm with enslaved labor. They did not want to be slaveholders. They were going to try to escape the fate of this society. And Jefferson said, but you'll get to be near me, right? Don't you want to do that? And so, you know, to me, the most horrible thing that I think I ever found in there was that he would, it was sort of like, you know, no, just smoke this crack pipe, right? You know, just, right. I mean, that kind of thing was terrible.
Wow. Darren, next to you is Darren.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how do you think Jefferson would feel, because as you described him as a misogynist and stuff, about female historians taking such an interest in him?
I think he would be appalled. I do. You know, I can remember there's another president who says, you know, this was Lincoln when Jessie Benton Fremont took him the Emancipation Proclamation that her husband John had issued for the Department of Missouri at the beginning of the Civil War. And she took the train to Washington, D.C. to brace Lincoln and say, you know, you must hear, you know, please understand we have to do this. Lincoln said, well, you're quite a lady politician. And he did not mean that as a compliment. And I think Jefferson had something like the same view. He thought women were made for better off confining themselves to domestic activities. So the idea that Sherry and I would be sitting up here, Sherry as a law professor, me as a history professor, both of us as authors, you know, taking, you know, standing up in public and owning this and voting and doing all these things, I think would be appalling to him.
Let's go to the second row. Starting with Jasmine. Jasmine, can you stand up, please?
How did you go about doing the research on these women?
I am one of the most fortunate people in the world because there are two things that you can do when you do research these days. One of them is go to an archive, and that's the traditional way. And I was able to go to a number of archives, beginning with the Library of Congress, but also to the University of Virginia, to the Huntington Library, and a variety of other places where I was able, in Massachusetts Historical Society. So there are a number of collections. And then I also had a fellowship at the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. So that was great. But the other thing right now is if you go to the Monticello website, monticello.org, and you can get access to an enormous amount of information, a lot of correspondence, as well as the Library of Congress American Memory website has all of their holdings of Jefferson's papers online. You can read them in manuscript form, you can read them in transcribed form. So you could sit and do a lot of this work in your bunny slippers at home with your coffee cup. And so I was lucky to be able to do that.
That's great. Next to Jasmine, I think is Donna. Can you stand up, please?
So you mentioned a series of disappointments, but is there also a series of admirations that you have for Jefferson?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, of course. You know, I mean, the kinds of affectionate letters he had with his granddaughters, I think, were one of the really delightful things. Thinking about getting a chance to go to Monticello and see this place that he made and the extraordinary beauty of it. Of course, as a place, it's you could say it's a place that he made. It's obviously a place that was, created and maintained by enslaved people and by the labor of the women around him. And one of the really interesting and kind of fun things about going to Monticello is plantations are little societies each in their own because they're so geographically isolated. You know a lot about this. And in his case, this is a plantation that is an unusually female world. Many plantations you would find, lots of sons around or brothers or that kind of thing. I mean, it was him living there first, with his wife and with his mother across the way who was widowed. Then after his wife dies, it's all the women of the Hemmings family and other enslaved families there, as well as the women of his own family. No sons-in-law who kind of come and go. So this is a female and, in many ways, a place that is a very interesting society. So that I thought was great too. But he's such a contradictory guy. There's so much to admire. I mean, you can imagine him, writing beautiful letters to women. There's some romantic letters in there too, to a woman in France. There's lots to see. Read the book.
Yeah, I think James Adams, was it John Adams who said that he was a walking contradiction?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was the perfect way to summarize Jefferson.
Yeah, and John Adams prided on himself on being consistent.
Yes,
and I think was pretty consistent.
Exactly.
But Jefferson, I don't think there was a day he got up out of bed that he wasn't face to face with something that in many cases, in his affectionate, benevolent, loving way, required a pretty strong measure of self-deception.
Yes. That's a good point. Next, Scott.
Hi, thanks for coming. I had two interrelated questions. Were there any challenges to his will? Were the terms carried out? And those folks that he emancipated, did they have to leave the state of Virginia?
Good question. Excellent lawyer question. As far as I know, no challenges to the will per se. Okay. Much later on, the sort of terms of how the legacy will be carried out has been challenged a number of times. But the will itself, no one challenged because basically it was about him having to liquidate everything because he's $100,000 in debt. So he did attempt to try to save a little bit for his daughter Patsy, who was the only child of his who survived him, Patsy Randolph. And he did something that, in fact, in line with your question, was an absolute, in some ways, abhorrent to him. He wrote a codicil to that will that declared her to be a femme sole, which was to treat her as if she was not married. Mm-hmm. And it was an attempt to protect her, whatever property she might inherit, from her husband's creditors, because her husband had already gone bust, right? Well, I mean, there was nothing to inherit, so it really didn't, he thought, at least, by doing something that I would otherwise never do, maybe I kept a little bit. But what they did do was, in some cases, when, everything goes up on the auction block. If you go back to Monticello now, apart from the human beings that are being sold, all of the possessions, all of the things he brought back from France, this is all being auctioned off. And his grandson, Jeff Randolph, was able to buy back a number of human property persons,
Right.
and some of the belongings. But his daughter, Patsy, basically is homeless and bankrupt,
Right.
and has to go and kind of live among her children. So
Yes.
that's his biggest failure, that he didn't protect them in the end.
But one thing he did do in that codicil is he honored his commitment to Sally because he freed the last two children who were coming of age as he was dying. And plus he arranged for Sally to go free by living with the two boys.
Right.
And I think Scott's reference is the petition
Right.
to have his executors petition so that the two boys could stay in Virginia.
That's exactly right. And thank you for pointing that out because everybody else who was free did have to leave, but in their case, they were able to live in a house on Main Street to take care of their aging mother, who is younger than I am now. So, the idea of them taking care of her, I suspect she was probably pretty able to take care of herself. And then once she died, they actually both went to Ohio. Mm-hmm. But he was very careful to honor that commitment to her. So there's yet another, demonstration of his feelings for her and his sacred obligation to her to honor the promise that he made.
Yeah, that's a good point. Other questions in the back row? Brittany?
Yes, you had said you originally planned for the book to be about what Jefferson thought about women. How did it evolve to the women Jefferson loved?
Well, some of this has to do with if you're going to write a book, you have to like it enough to finish it. And I got so sick of the sort of sexism of the thing that I just was like, I don't think I can write a book that's entirely about this. But the other thing is that as somebody who's written a lot of stuff about women's history, I felt like the women in their own right deserved to have their stories told. And when I first started out writing the book and researching the book, there were lots of Jefferson historians. I can remember one very, very prominent historian of early America, who actually happens to be a woman, very famous historian, who said to me, well, maybe you should write a romance novel instead, dear, because there just aren't enough documents on these women. Oh. And, what I was able to discover is, having done a lot of work on women's history, is you got to read the gaps. So I think I've done that a lot in here because these, as I say, these are expurgated papers. Every time Sally Hemings would have been mentioned in a letter or something like that, the letter goes missing, or in some cases, pages of letters are missing.
Wow.
So somebody put a lot of stuff in the fire, right? Yes. But there are other sources, his account books, his commonplace books, other people's letters. There are ways of getting around that.
Right, and I think Fawn Brody pointed out one indication of his affection for Sally was that he spent $200 in clothes for her in France, which was the equivalent of like 40 grand.
Right.
Yeah, so he was really adorning her in a nice fashion.
Right, and and I'm sure that that didn't go unremarked when she came back to Monticello, dressed in nice things, and evidently, through the rest of her life, continued to use French words and things like that. So that's an important, kind of moment in her life. But also thinking about, are there sources?
Right.
This is our question. The lives of ordinary people. How do you find out about them? And my point ultimately was, well, compared to Thomas Jefferson, we don't have a lot about them. Mm-hmm. Compared to most of the people who've lived, we have way more than enough information to write about them. So it's relative.
That's great. Virginia, this has been so fabulous. I've been trying to get you on the show for years. I'm glad we finally succeeded, and you have more than proved why I really wanted to have you as a guest. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I loved it.
Thank you, the audience, for joining us for this segment of Arts Talk with Virginia Scharff, the author of The Women Jefferson Loved.